everybody, it's Kayla from Burlington Green with our third video for our Green Space video series. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the many Indigenous communities that have cared for the land for thousands of years. Burlington, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Haudenosaunee to the Métis, our lands spanning from Lake Ontario to the Niagara Escarpment are steeped in Indigenous history. These lands of green space, parkland, forests, and trails exist today because of Indigenous respect, governance, and protection of the land. I'd like to thank TD Park people for allowing us to continue this meaningful work of highlighting the importance of green space protection, enjoyment, and restoration. I have some tips to share, courtesy of Green Venture, to ensure we are doing our part to help minimize the spread of invasive plant species. In addition, we will hear from Kristen from Field and Stream Rescue Team to share more about invasive species. But first, let's get to the top tips on being respectful and responsible visitors to trails, conservation areas, and other green spaces. Tip number 1, stay on trails and help stop the spread of invasive species. While going off trails might seem fun and a way to explore, this actually creates a greater risk of spreading invasive plant species. Tip number 2, seed checks. Check yourself for seeds after you leave a green space. If you do find seeds on you, place them in a secured garbage bag to ensure they do not blow away and germinate. If you have a pet traveling with you, be sure to check your pet, as the paws can be a perfect space for those seeds to wedge in between. If you are boating, kayaking, canoeing, or anything else in the water, be sure to check the underside of the boat for invasive species as well. Tip number 3, citizen science. Do you see something in your neighborhood that doesn't belong? You can add your sighting to a website called EdMaps. This site engages users with information on invasive species, natural resources, forest health, and more. Tip number 4, join local invasive species removal or native planting teams like Burlington Green, Bay Area Restoration Council, Green Venture, Royal Botanical Gardens, and more. Or help remove invasive species in your backyard and encourage your neighbors to do the same. Tip number 5, plant native species. While the planting season will soon be wrapping up, winter months provide the opportunity to do some research on native plants or pollinator-friendly plants. And it's never too early to start planting. If you have a bright indoor spot for some seedlings, you can start planting earlier. Tip number 6, leave no trace. We chatted about this in the first green space video, and I think a lot of us are already familiar with this tip. But essentially, leaving no trace means leaving no evidence that you were really even there in the first place. This means cleaning up all your litter and belongings, and if you're super keen, you can even put together a small cleanup crew and clean up an area near your house. BG can help supply gloves and bags to help you help the earth. So now, let's cut to Kristen and see what she has to say on invasive plant species.
Thanks, Kayla. So I'm going to talk about a few easy ways that we can control invasive species in our own environment, and I'm going to lay it out in 3 basic steps. So, step 1, and probably the most basic, is don't be a spreader. And this means don't plant invasive species in the first place. Invasive species are generally non-native species that don't have any natural competitors, and this is what allows them to outcompete and take over our natural systems. A lot of nurseries actually still sell plants that could be potentially invasive, so it's important to choose native plants when you're preparing your own garden and also know what plants could potentially be invasive. And this is especially important if you live adjacent to a natural area. Some examples of common garden plants that can easily become invasive include goutweed, periwinkle, English ivy, and barberry, just to name a few. So remember, source your plants from local areas and don't move or purchase plant material from far away. Step 2 is probably the more complicated and difficult one, and that is get rid of them. So we're somewhat limited when it comes to what we can use to get rid of invasive species in our homes. Some species like garlic mustard, buckthorn, and other spreading invasives can reproduce with only a tiny bit of root material left behind. So it's important to do the job thoroughly and fully. So a great way to get rid of a large patch of invasives can be solarization. Generally, this includes covering a large patch with a tarp or piece of dark plastic so that all the plant material underneath gets toasted from the sun. It's really important to remember to keep an eye on the edges to make sure that nothing is creeping out, and also to remember that this method can take several seasons to be complete. The most common and basic method for removing invasive species is pulling them out manually, but there are a few things to remember here as well. It's important to be patient and make sure you're pulling out the entire root system, and make sure that the plants aren't seeding, as you can actually make the problem worse. We also have to be careful to dispose of the plant material carefully. Don't leave it on the ground and let it dry out or die completely before disposing of it with waste or other garden material. And finally, step 3 is to keep an eye out. The best time to handle invasive species is at first sight. Invasives can easily get out of control and become overwhelming and too hard to handle. That means we have to nip it in the bud, remove the invasives yourselves, or talk to the property owner or volunteer group about potential removal efforts. And spread the word to your friends. Don't be afraid to point out invasive species to other people so that they know as well. Controlling invasive species can be a huge endeavor, but the more people that know how to identify and prevent them, and eventually remove them, the better our efforts can be. So do your research, find out what invasive species are common in your area, and how to potentially prevent or remove them. Think carefully and do your research before you plant material in your own garden. And remember to use all the amazing resources that your local volunteer groups have provided to get involved and get more information. Thanks.
Thanks so much to Kristen for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. While there are a lot of events on hold, there is still so much we can do to help our local green spaces. Thanks again to Green Venture for sharing these tips with us. And of course, thank you to TD Park People for sponsoring this video. Complete our brief survey through the link in the caption and tell us what Burlington's green spaces mean to you for a chance to win a $25 Met gift card. Thanks so much for watching. Time to go enjoy this beautiful green space. Bye.